Somewhere north of the 59th parallel, the sun is already giving up for the day. It's not even 5 in the afternoon, but the light over Anchorage has gone the color of a bruise, purple sliding into black, and the temperature is doing something it does for nearly half the year here, falling steadily, without much interest in stopping. Tonight it will drop past 0. Not just cold, Alaska cold, the kind that turns exposed skin waxy in minutes, that makes metal feel like it's burning you instead of freezing you. The kind meteorologists describe in careful clinical language because the plain language is too frightening to put on a graphic. If you're warm right now, wrapped in a blanket, maybe with a fan humming somewhere in the room, take a second to notice that. Really notice it. It's not nothing. Somewhere out there tonight, in that same brutal air, human beings without 4 walls and a locked door are getting ready to do what they do almost every night from October through April. Figure out how to still be alive by morning. This isn't a story about tragedy for its own sake, and it isn't a story designed to make you feel guilty for being warm. It's something quieter than that. It's a walk through the practical, unglamorous, remarkably intelligent set of decisions that people without permanent shelter make every single evening in one of the harshest inhabited places on the planet. Where to go, what to wear, who to trust, how to sleep in a way that doesn't turn dangerous. There is nothing cinematic about it. There's just cold and more cold, and a kind of quiet human competence that rarely gets talked about because it doesn't announce itself. It just survives. So if you're here to drift off, go ahead and let your eyes get heavy whenever they want to. There's no test at the end. Just get comfortable. Maybe pull that blanket up an inch higher than you normally would, and let this play in the background while Anchorage and Fairbanks and the small towns between them settle into another long winter night. If this kind of quiet, thoughtful storytelling is something you'd like more of, subscribing helps more of it get made, but only if it's actually helping you unwind. Now, let's follow the cold as it comes down over the city and the people who are about to meet it head on. By 4:30, the last of the daylight is already a memory, and the temperature is sliding in a way that anyone who's lived through an Alaskan winter knows to take seriously. It isn't the kind of cold that arrives all at once, dramatic and sudden. It's slower than that, and in some ways more dangerous, because it gives you just enough time to think you have more time than you do. The wind picks up along the inlet, funneling between buildings downtown, cutting through anything less than serious insulation. A weather service alert scrolls across phone screens that many people out here don't have anymore, warning of wind chills approaching -20, -25, numbers that stop being abstract very quickly once you're standing in them. For most of the city, this is background noise, a reason to warm up the car a little longer, to grab a heavier coat on the way out. But for a population that outreach workers estimate numbers in the low thousands statewide, a meaningful share of them concentrated in Anchorage, this shift in the air is the beginning of the most important calculation of the day. Where am I sleeping tonight? Not in some abstract, someday sense. Specifically, in the next few hours, before the cold stops being merely uncomfortable and starts being lethal. There's a pattern to how this calculation happens, one that repeats itself with such regularity that people who've spent years without stable housing describe it almost like a checklist, even if they'd never call it that. First, the shelters. Is there a bed tonight? Is the cold weather overflow open? Has a bus already gone out to pick people up? Second, if the shelters are full or too far, or, for some, simply not somewhere they feel safe going, then it's warming centers, day facilities that sometimes stretch their hours during extreme cold, libraries and transit centers that offer a few more hours of heat before closing. Third, if none of that lines up, It's the harder options. A car with a working heater and enough gas to run it in bursts through the night, a stairwell that traps a little warmth, a doorway out of the wind, and as an absolute last resort, a tent or improvised shelter built from whatever insulating material can be found, set up somewhere sheltered from the worst of the wind. What's striking, talking to outreach workers who do this every winter, is how unsentimental and practical this process is. It isn't panic, it's triage, done by people who have done it enough times that it's become almost procedural. A woman named Dolores, not her real name, but a composite drawn from accounts outreach teams have shared over the years, has survived 9 winters in Anchorage without permanent housing. She describes her evening routine the way someone might describe checking the oil in a car before a long drive. You check the wind. You check what's open. You check who's around and whether tonight is a night to be near others or a night to find somewhere quiet and alone. Every decision has a reason behind it, even if the reason isn't visible from the outside. The city itself becomes a kind of map only some people can read. A stairwell behind a particular downtown building holds heat longer than most because of how the ventilation runs. A 24-hour laundromat a few blocks from the transit center will let people sit as long as they're not causing trouble, and the dryers throw off enough warmth to make the whole room bearable for an hour or two. The public library, when it's open, is one of the few places in the city where nobody asks you to buy something to stay. And during cold snaps, its hours sometimes stretch to accommodate exactly this need. None of these are secrets exactly, but they're knowledge that gets passed, person to person, the way any survival skill does, refined over years by people who had no other choice but to learn it. As the light disappears entirely and the temperature keeps dropping, this knowledge becomes the difference between a hard night and a genuinely dangerous one. Frostbite doesn't wait for anyone's convenience. Exposed skin in wind chills this severe can start to freeze in under 30 minutes, sometimes faster if the skin is damp, if circulation is already compromised by exhaustion or poor nutrition, if the person hasn't eaten enough that day to keep their internal furnace running. Hypothermia is quieter and, in some ways, more insidious. It creeps in as fatigue, as a strange calm, as the urge to just sit down and rest for a minute, which is exactly the moment when resting for a minute can turn into never getting up again. People who've survived multiple winters out here know this instinctively, even if they've never read a medical textbook on it. They know the signs to watch for in themselves, and just as importantly, in each other. Because that's the other thing this evening ritual depends on. Other people. Nobody survives an Alaskan winter on the street entirely alone. Not for long. There are informal networks that form among people experiencing homelessness here, loose but real systems of checking in, sharing information, splitting up who goes where, so that no single doorway or stairwell gets so crowded it draws attention from police or property owners. Somebody remembers who was struggling the night before and makes a point of finding them again tonight. Somebody else has an extra blanket and knows exactly who needs it more than they do. This isn't organized in any formal sense. It's simply what happens when survival depends on collective memory and mutual watchfulness, the way it has for humans in harsh climates for longer than any of us have been keeping records. By 6 o'clock, the outreach vans are usually out, small teams from local nonprofits driving slow loops through downtown and the areas where people are known to gather, checking on regulars by name, offering rides to shelters, handing out hand warmers and extra layers when they have them. It's unglamorous work, done mostly in silence, mostly unnoticed by anyone not looking for it. The vans know where to look because the same handful of streets, parks, and transit hubs tend to be where people end up, drawn there by the same logic that draws anyone anywhere: proximity to services, some measure of visibility that keeps them safer than total isolation, and simple familiarity, the comfort of a spot that's worked before. For those who make it into a shelter tonight, the evening shifts into something closer to a routine most people would recognize. A line forming outside a building with steamed-up windows, the particular warmth of stepping through a door out of subzero air, the low hum of dozens of people settling in for the night in a space that was never quite designed to hold this many cots but does anyway, because the alternative is unthinkable. For those who don't make it inside, the evening becomes something else entirely. A slower, more careful negotiation with the cold, one that will stretch across the coming hours in ways we're about to follow closely. But for now, as the last of the outreach vans finish their rounds and the city settles into full winter darkness, it's enough to notice this first quiet truth. Nobody out here tonight is passive. Every single person making their way toward whatever shelter they can find is engaged in an active, ongoing act of problem-solving, drawing on knowledge built night after night, winter after winter. It's not luck that gets most people through a night like this. It's preparation, memory, and community. Three things that don't show up in any statistic, but matter more than almost anything else once the temperature starts to fall. The warming center on the edge of downtown doesn't look like much from the outside. A low municipal building, fluorescent light leaking out through frosted windows, a hand-lettered sign taped to the door listing tonight's hours, extended because of the cold snap. But for the people filing in as the evening deepens, it represents something close to the whole ballgame. Inside, folding chairs line the walls in loose rows, a coffee urn works overtime in the corner, and the air carries that particular smell of wet wool and instant coffee that seems to exist in every shelter and community center in the world. It isn't glamorous. Nobody would call it comfortable in any conventional sense. But it's heated, and tonight, that single fact outweighs every other consideration. Warming centers occupy a specific niche in the winter survival landscape, distinct from overnight shelters in ways that matter a great deal to the people using them. Where a shelter offers a bed and, ideally, a full night's stay, a warming center is often simpler and more flexible. A place to sit, to be indoors, to escape the wind chill for a few hours without necessarily committing to staying until morning. Some operate around the clock during the coldest stretches of the year. Others open only when temperatures cross a specific threshold, activated by an emergency declaration that mobilizes additional space, additional staff, sometimes additional buildings that don't normally serve this purpose at all. A recreation center, a church basement, a community hall pressed into service because the standard shelter capacity simply isn't enough for a night like this one. The mechanics of how a city like Anchorage decides to open emergency warming space are more bureaucratic than most people imagine. But the bureaucracy exists for a good reason. Municipal governments and nonprofit partners track forecasted temperatures the way farther south cities track hurricane paths, watching wind chill projections days in advance and coordinating well before the worst of the cold actually arrives. When forecasts cross a dangerous threshold, additional shelter capacity gets activated, extra staff get called in, and outreach teams intensify their rounds specifically to steer people toward the newly available space. It's a system built from hard experience. From winters when the gap between demand and capacity became a matter of life and death, and cities across Alaska learned, sometimes painfully, how much margin they actually needed to build in. Inside the warming center tonight, the crowd is a mix that would surprise anyone picturing a single, uniform population. There are older men who've been navigating homelessness for years, quiet and economical in their movements, settling into the same chair they claimed the night before, as if by unspoken agreement with everyone else in the room. There are younger people, some of them recently arrived in the city, chasing seasonal work that fell through, still learning the informal rules of this world. There are a few families, which staff describe as one of the hardest situations to manage, given how few facilities are equipped to keep children together with their parents overnight. And there are people whose path here involves addiction, mental illness, or both, layered on top of the same basic problem everyone else in the room is dealing with. Nowhere else warm enough to be tonight. The staff working these facilities, most of them employed by local nonprofits and a smaller number of city employees, describe the job in terms that have less to do with heroics and more to do with logistics. Counting heads, making sure the coffee doesn't run out, de-escalating the occasional conflict that flares up when too many stressed, exhausted people are packed into too small a space for too many hours, watching for the specific signs of someone in real medical danger, confusion, slurred speech, skin that's gone an unusual color, and getting them to emergency care fast, because a warming center isn't equipped to treat frostbite or hypothermia once it's already taken hold. It's triage and hospitality at once, done by people who mostly don't get thanked for it and mostly aren't doing it for the thanks. For someone spending the night in a facility like this, the physical experience is its own kind of endurance test, just a gentler one than the alternative. Folding chairs are not designed for sleep, and most warming centers don't have enough cots to go around, especially on the coldest nights when demand spikes hardest. People improvise, leaning against walls, resting heads on rolled-up jackets, sleeping in the strange, upright half-doze that becomes its own skill after enough practice. The lights, for safety and supervision reasons, rarely go fully dark. The noise never entirely stops. A low murmur of coughing, shifting, occasional conversation carrying through the room until the early hours. It's not restful in the way most of us think about rest, but it is warm and it is safe from the specific danger waiting just outside the door. And for people who've spent enough winters figuring out the alternative, that trade is not a difficult one to make. Not everyone who needs a warming center makes it to one, and the reasons are more varied than simple distance or lack of information. Some shelters have rules: no active intoxication, no pets, gender-segregated sleeping areas that exclude people who can't or won't comply, whether because of addiction, because they refuse to be separated from an animal that's become their closest companion, or because past experiences in institutional settings have left them unwilling to enter one again. Outreach workers spend a significant portion of every cold night specifically trying to bridge this gap, building enough trust over repeated encounters that someone who's avoided shelters for years might finally agree to come inside, at least for tonight, at least until the worst of the cold snap passes. There's a particular kind of patience this requires, one that doesn't show up in any training manual, but that every experienced outreach worker develops over time. You don't argue someone into a warming center. You show up night after night in the same spot with the same calm offer until eventually, sometimes after months, sometimes after years, the offer gets accepted. It's slow, unglamorous work, built on the accumulation of small trust rather than any single dramatic intervention, and it's one of the quieter engines keeping people alive through Alaska's winters. even though almost nobody outside the field ever hears about it. By 9 or 10 at night, the warming center has settled into its steadiest rhythm of the evening. The initial rush of arrivals long past, the room quieter, most of its occupants either dozing or talking in low voices with the particular camaraderie that develops among people who've shared enough hard nights together to recognize each other on sight. Staff make their rounds, checking on anyone who looks unwell, refilling the coffee one more time before it runs dry for the night. Outside, the wind hasn't let up, and the temperature keeps its slow, steady fall toward the coldest hours still ahead. But inside, for the people who made it through the door tonight, the most dangerous part of the evening has already passed. They are warm. They are, for the next several hours at least, safe. And in a winter like this one, that is very far from a small thing. Warmth, once you're finally inside it after hours in the cold, is not the simple relief it sounds like. It arrives almost violently at first, a stinging, prickling flood of sensation as blood returns to fingers and toes that had begun going numb somewhere back on the walk over. A headache blooming behind the eyes as the body recalibrates all at once. People who've experienced this enough times learn not to rush it, not to shove their hands directly against a radiator or hold their feet too close to a heat vent, because the temptation to speed up the thaw can do real damage to skin and tissue that's already been stressed by cold. Instead, the smart move, the one experienced people teach the newer arrivals almost without thinking about it, is to warm slowly, layer by layer. Let the body find its own way back to a normal temperature, rather than forcing it. This is where clothing stops being a matter of appearance and becomes, quite literally, a survival system. And it's worth understanding in some detail, because the logic behind it is more sophisticated than most people ever have reason to learn. The foundation of staying warm through an Alaskan winter night without central heating isn't really about how thick any single layer is. It's about the relationship between layers, moisture management on the inside, insulation in the middle, wind and water resistance on the outside. Get that relationship wrong, and even the warmest looking coat in the world won't be enough. Get it right, and even modest gear can carry a person through remarkably brutal conditions. The innermost layer against the skin exists for one job above all others, moving moisture away from the body. Sweat, even in freezing temperatures, is a genuine hazard because damp fabric conducts heat away from the body many times faster than dry fabric does. This is why experienced people avoid cotton against the skin whenever they can help it. Cotton absorbs moisture and holds onto it, turning what should be an insulating layer into a cold, clinging liability the moment a person works up even a little sweat from walking or carrying belongings. Synthetic base layers, or wool when it's available, handle this far better, wicking moisture outward and drying quickly, keeping the skin dry even through exertion. The middle layer is where the real insulation lives, and here the goal is trapped air, not raw bulk. A down jacket works not because down itself is warm, but because down traps thousands of tiny air pockets that the body's own heat warms up and holds in place. This is also why wet down is close to useless. The moment those air pockets collapse and fill with water, the insulating property disappears almost entirely, which is why keeping gear dry matters as much as having enough of it in the first place. People without stable housing often layer multiple middle pieces rather than relying on one, a fleece under a heavier coat, sweaters stacked over each other. Whatever combination of donated and found clothing adds up to enough trapped air to hold body heat through a subzero night. The outer layer exists to defend everything underneath it. blocking wind and shedding moisture from snow or freezing rain. Wind is a critical, often underestimated part of this equation, because even air that isn't especially cold in absolute terms becomes dangerous once it's moving fast enough to strip heat away from exposed skin and thin clothing. A functional windbreaker or shell layer, even a relatively thin one, can make an enormous difference in how a body experiences a given temperature, which is part of why donated gear, even items that look inadequate to someone unfamiliar with cold weather survival, can matter so much when it's the right piece filling the right gap in someone's layering system. Extremities get special attention in this system, and for good reason. They're where frostbite starts, almost always, because the body's circulatory response to severe cold prioritizes the core over the hands, feet, ears, and nose, restricting blood flow to those areas specifically to protect vital organs. This is a smart evolutionary trade-off for short-term survival, but it means fingers and toes bear the brunt of the danger on a long, cold night. Experienced people layer socks carefully, sometimes 2 pairs, choosing wool over cotton for the same moisture reasons as the base layer, and they watch their feet obsessively for the specific early warning signs of frostbite. Numbness that doesn't resolve with movement, skin that's gone unusually pale or waxy, a loss of the normal, slightly painful sensitivity to cold that healthy skin maintains. Hats matter more than most people realize, not because of the popular myth about losing most body heat through the head, which turns out to be somewhat exaggerated, but simply because the head and neck are almost always left exposed by other layering choices, and any exposed skin is a place heat can escape freely. A good hat, ideally one that covers the ears fully, paired with a scarf or neck gaiter that can be pulled up over the nose and mouth in the worst wind, closes off one of the last remaining gaps in an otherwise well-built system. Gloves present their own particular challenge because fine motor tasks, opening a bag, managing money, even just holding a cup of coffee, become difficult or impossible in the heaviest mittens, which pushes people toward thinner gloves that trade some warmth for usability. Experienced people often carry both, switching between a thin working glove and a heavier mitten depending on what the next few minutes demand, tucking the mittens into a coat or bag when hands need to be free, and putting them back on the instant that task is finished. None of this gear appears from nowhere, and the supply chain behind it is worth understanding, because it reveals just how much of winter survival here depends on a network of donation drives, church groups, and non-profit gear closets operating quietly behind the scenes. Local organizations run coat drives every fall, collecting donated jackets, boots, sleeping bags, and blankets specifically to distribute before the coldest months arrive. Outreach teams carry extra hand warmers and emergency blankets on their nightly rounds precisely because they know how quickly a missing piece of gear can turn a survivable night into a dangerous one. Sleeping bags rated for genuinely extreme cold, the kind rated well below zero, not the summer camping bags found in most donation bins, are especially prized and especially scarce, passed carefully from person to person, sometimes literally handed down from someone moving into housing to someone who still needs it on the street. There's a particular expertise that develops in people who've survived multiple winters this way, a kind of applied knowledge that outreach workers describe with real respect. Longtime residents of Anchorage's street community can often assess, at a glance, whether someone's current setup is going to get them through the night or not, whether that jacket has enough loft left in it, whether those boots are actually waterproof or just look like they should be, whether the person wearing them understands the layering logic well enough to have gotten dressed in the right order. This knowledge gets passed along constantly, in small, unremarkable exchanges throughout the evening. someone pointing out that a friend's socks look damp, someone else offering a spare hat because they noticed ears going pink in the cold. It's mentorship, essentially, happening in real time, driven by the simple fact that everyone in this world understands exactly what's at stake if the lesson doesn't land. By the time full darkness has settled over the city and the temperature has dropped into its steepest overnight decline, the people who've assembled their layers carefully are noticeably more at ease than those who haven't. It shows in small ways. Steadier hands, less shivering, a kind of settled calm instead of the restless discomfort of someone whose gear isn't quite doing its job. This is the quiet, unglamorous science running underneath every winter night on Alaska's streets. Not luck, not toughness in some vague, mythical sense, but a genuinely sophisticated understanding of how heat moves, how moisture betrays warmth, and how the human body can be protected against conditions it was never built to survive unassisted, protected well enough, most nights, for most people, to make it all the way through to morning. Not everyone spends the coldest hours of the night in a shelter or warming center, and understanding why requires setting aside any assumption that people simply haven't found their way to help yet. For a meaningful portion of Anchorage's unsheltered population, a parked car represents the most reliable, most private, and in some ways most practical option available on a given night. Assuming it runs, assuming there's fuel, assuming the person has found a place to park where nobody's going to knock on the window and move them along before morning. A working vehicle changes the entire math of surviving a winter night, turning what would otherwise be an exposed, wind-battered ordeal into something closer to a controlled, if uncomfortable, waiting game. The logic is straightforward once you think it through. A car, even an old and unreliable one, offers a sealed space that blocks wind entirely, which on its own accounts for a significant portion of how dangerous a given temperature actually feels. Run the engine and heater for 10 or 15 minutes every hour or two, and the interior climbs back to something tolerable, sometimes genuinely comfortable, before the person shuts it off again to conserve fuel and waits for the chill to build back up enough to justify running it again. It's a rationing system, essentially, one that experienced car dwellers manage with real precision, tracking fuel levels and outside temperature together, doing mental math about how many more cycles of warmth they can afford before the tank runs dry, or the money for more gas runs out. There are real dangers built into this system, and the people who live it are almost universally aware of them, because the alternative to awareness is a level of risk nobody survives multiple winters by ignoring. Carbon monoxide poisoning from running an engine in a snow-covered or poorly ventilated area is a genuine, recurring hazard, one that outreach workers and public health campaigns specifically warn about every winter, because a car half buried in drifted snow can trap exhaust in ways that aren't obvious from inside the vehicle until it's already a medical emergency. Experienced car dwellers learn to clear snow away from the exhaust pipe before running the engine, to crack a window slightly, even in brutal cold, to never, under any circumstances, fall fully asleep with the engine running unattended. It's a rule learned the hard way by enough people, over enough winters, that it's become close to universal knowledge within this specific survival culture. Where to actually park matters just as much as having a car in the first place. Some spots are known, informally, as relatively safe and low visibility. A church parking lot where a pastor has quietly agreed to look the other way. A stretch of street near a 24-hour business where a car sitting overnight doesn't draw much attention. A Walmart or similar big box lot where overnight parking is technically tolerated in a way it wouldn't be on a residential street. Police in Anchorage, like in many cities, have some discretion in how they handle a person sleeping in a legally parked car, and a good relationship with, or at least a low profile from, local law enforcement, can make the difference between an undisturbed night and one interrupted by a knock on the window at 2 in the morning. For those without a working vehicle and without a spot in a shelter, the options narrow further. And this is where the city's architecture itself becomes part of the survival calculation. Stairwells, particularly interior or partially enclosed ones attached to parking garages or office buildings, block wind almost as effectively as a car does, and some retain a surprising amount of residual warmth from the building they're attached to, especially near heating vents or exhaust points. Transit centers and bus shelters offer more modest protection, enough to break the worst of the wind, though rarely enough to hold real warmth. But they carry the advantage of being public space where a person technically has a right to sit, at least during operating hours, without needing anyone's explicit permission. Doorways remain one of the oldest, most universal forms of improvised shelter, and in a cold climate city, an experienced person develops a genuinely detailed mental catalog of which doorways work best. Depth matters, since a deeper doorway blocks more wind on more sides. Orientation matters, since a doorway facing away from the prevailing wind direction offers real protection that one facing directly into it simply doesn't. Some doorways sit above heating grates or near building exhaust vents that leak a small but meaningful amount of warmth into the immediate area, and these spots, once discovered, tend to be closely guarded knowledge, shared carefully within trusted circles rather than broadcast widely, since a good spot only stays good as long as too many people aren't fighting over it. When none of these options are available or safe, the last resort is a fully improvised shelter, a tent if one can be had, or in its absence, a structure built from whatever insulating material is on hand, tucked into a wind-sheltered location like a stand of trees, an underpass, or a similarly protected pocket in the landscape. Building this kind of shelter well is a genuine skill, one that draws, whether people realize it or not, on the same basic cold weather engineering principles that survival experts and indigenous Alaskan communities have refined over centuries. Insulation from the ground matters enormously, since the cold earth or snow beneath a person pulls heat away far faster than the air above them does, which is why experienced people prioritize a thick base layer of cardboard, foam, or extra clothing beneath themselves before worrying much about what's covering them on top. A smaller enclosed space holds body heat more effectively than a large one, which is why the most effective improvised shelters tend to be snug rather than roomy, sized just large enough for a person to fit inside comfortably, rather than built for extra space that only has to be warmed unnecessarily. Snow itself, counterintuitively, can become an ally in this system, rather than simply a threat. Packed snow has genuine insulating properties, trapping air within its structure in a way that can moderate temperature swings inside a shelter built partially from it, which is part of why traditional snow shelters have kept people alive in Arctic conditions for as long as humans have lived in them. Few people surviving on Anchorage's streets are building true snow caves, but the underlying principle, using available materials to trap dead air and block wind, shows up again and again in the improvised shelters that do get built, whether the material is snow, cardboard, tarps, or some combination of whatever happened to be available that particular night. Running through all of these options, whichever one a given person ends up relying on tonight, is the same undercurrent of community that shaped the earlier decision about which shelter or warming center to try first. People sharing a stretch of sidewalk or a cluster of parked cars tend to know each other, at least by sight, and tend to keep a loose, informal watch over one another through the night. Someone will check on a neighbor's car to make sure the engine's still running when it's supposed to be. Someone else will notice if a person who's usually in a particular doorway hasn't shown up and will ask around to make sure they're all right. This isn't formalized in any way, and it isn't universal. Trust breaks down sometimes. Conflicts happen. And not everyone in this world is equally looked after. But the pattern is real and well documented by the outreach workers and researchers who've spent time studying how unsheltered communities actually function, and it represents one of the quieter, less visible reasons that survival rates through Alaska's brutal winters are as high as they are, given how genuinely dangerous the conditions can be. As the night deepens further and the temperature bottoms out somewhere in the coldest hours before dawn, the calculations happening across the city. Inside cars with engines cycling on and off, inside doorways chosen for their depth and orientation, inside improvised shelters built from cardboard and packed snow. All share the same underlying logic. Block the wind. Trap the warmth. Watch for the signs of real danger in yourself and in the people around you. It's not a system anyone would choose if better options were available, and everyone living it would say so without hesitation. But it is, remarkably, a system that works, more often than not, built from generations of accumulated knowledge about how to survive extreme cold with almost nothing standing between a person and the elements, except preparation, awareness, and each other. The deepest hours of the night in an Alaskan winter have a particular texture to them, one that anyone who's spent enough time outside in extreme cold learns to recognize. It's the stretch between roughly 1 and 5 in the morning, when the temperature reaches its lowest point of the entire cycle, when the last of the evening's activity has settled into stillness, and when the human body, left to its own devices, becomes most vulnerable to the specific dangers this climate presents. For people without stable indoor shelter, this window represents the hardest test of the night, and surviving it well depends less on any single decision and more on a set of habits, refined over repeated winters, that keep the body functioning through hours when everything about the environment is working against it. Sleep itself becomes a complicated proposition in these conditions, and most experienced people describe abandoning any expectation of the deep, uninterrupted rest most of us take for granted. Instead, sleep happens in a fragmented, cyclical pattern. Brief stretches of genuine unconsciousness interrupted by periods of half-awareness, driven partly by discomfort and partly by a kind of built-in vigilance that develops after enough winters of needing to notice quickly if something has gone wrong. A car's heater running low. A shelter partner who's gone unusually quiet. A change in the wind that's found its way through a gap in a shelter's construction. This isn't restful in any conventional sense, and the accumulated sleep deprivation is a real, serious cost that outreach workers and researchers both point to as one of the less visible harms of chronic homelessness in extreme climates. A wearing down that happens gradually, night after night, and that makes every other challenge of surviving without housing that much harder to face. Within this fragmented sleep pattern, though, there's a deliberate structure that experienced people build in on purpose, and it centers on regular, intentional movement. Staying still for too long in extreme cold is dangerous regardless of how well a person is layered, because circulation naturally slows during stillness, and slowed circulation means less warm blood reaching the extremities that are already at the highest risk. People who've survived multiple winters this way build in deliberate wake cycles, setting a phone alarm if they have one, or simply waking on their own from discomfort. Specifically to move their fingers and toes, to shift position, to do a quick physical check for the early warning signs of frostbite that can develop silently during a long, still stretch of sleep. It's an odd kind of discipline, imposing structure and vigilance onto what should be the most passive part of the day. But it's one of the clearest examples of how survival in this environment depends on active, ongoing effort, rather than simply enduring and hoping for the best. Food and calories play a bigger role in this than most people outside the experience would guess. The human body generates heat, in large part, by metabolizing fuel, which means a person who hasn't eaten enough during the day is quite literally running a colder furnace by the time the coldest hours of the night arrive. Outreach workers who distribute food during evening rounds emphasize this specifically, prioritizing calorie-dense options, foods with real fat and protein content, rather than anything light, precisely because they understand the direct link between a person's caloric intake earlier in the day and their ability to stay warm hours later. Experienced people learn to eat strategically when food is available, understanding on some level, even without the biology lesson, that a heavier meal before a cold night matters more than the same meal eaten at a different time might. Hydration presents a less obvious but genuinely important piece of this same puzzle. Cold air is dry air, and the body loses more moisture through breathing in freezing temperatures than most people realize, on top of the moisture lost through the exertion of staying warm and moving between locations. Dehydration compounds the risk of hypothermia in ways that aren't intuitive. It thickens the blood slightly, making circulation less efficient at exactly the moment efficient circulation matters most. Access to drinking water becomes its own small but real challenge for someone without stable shelter, since public water fountains freeze solid for months at a time, and carrying water bottles that don't themselves freeze requires its own bit of practical knowledge, often solved by keeping a bottle inside an inner layer of clothing, close to body heat, rather than in an outer pocket where it will turn to ice within an hour. As the night wears on past its coldest point and the first, faint suggestion of the coming dawn starts to change the quality of the darkness. Still hours away from actual sunrise in the depth of winter, but detectable to anyone paying close attention, a different kind of fatigue sets in, one that has less to do with the cold directly and more to do with the accumulated strain of having stayed alert in some form for most of the night. This is often described by people who've lived through many winters this way as the hardest psychological stretch, harder in some ways than the physical cold itself. The long, quiet hours when there's nothing to do but wait, when the body is tired but can't fully rest, when the mind has too much room to wander into difficult territory. Depression and anxiety are common companions to chronic homelessness under any conditions, and the isolation and physical strain of an Alaskan winter night intensify both, which is part of why the informal community networks that form among unsheltered people matter as much for psychological survival as they do for the practical logistics of staying warm. There are small rituals that help carry people through this stretch, and they vary from person to person, but share a common function, giving the mind something to hold on to besides the discomfort and the cold. Some people talk quietly with whoever's nearby, low conversations that stretch across hours and cover everything from practical planning for the coming day to memories of better times to nothing in particular at all. Just the simple comfort of another voice in the dark. Some people pray in whatever form matters to them personally. Some listen to music through cheap earbuds if they have a phone with enough battery left, rationing that battery as carefully as any other limited resource. Some simply focus on breathing, on the mechanics of staying warm, on getting through this hour so they can get through the next one, building the night into a series of small, achievable goals rather than one long, overwhelming stretch of endurance. As the darkness begins its slow, reluctant retreat, sunrise in Anchorage during the deepest part of winter doesn't arrive until well past 9 or even 10 in the morning, but the earliest hints of it start showing well before that. There's a shift in the collective mood of everyone who's made it through the night, whether they're in a car, a doorway, a shelter, or an improvised structure built from whatever was on hand. It's not relief exactly, not yet, because the cold hasn't actually lifted and won't for hours still. But it's something adjacent to relief. The recognition that the worst, coldest, most dangerous stretch of the night has passed, that daylight and its marginally warmer temperatures and its access to day shelters, libraries, and warming spaces are coming, even if slowly. People start to stir, to check on each other one more time, to begin the quiet, practiced process of getting ready to move again, carrying the accumulated exhaustion of another survived night into whatever the coming day will ask of them. It is, in its own understated way, a genuine achievement, repeated night after night, winter after winter, by people whose resilience rarely gets acknowledged by anyone outside the small, tight-knit world that understands exactly what it took to get through until morning. Morning in an Alaskan winter city arrives slowly and reluctantly, the sky brightening by degrees rather than announcing itself all at once. And for the people who've spent the night outside, indoors in a shelter, or curled in the back seat of a parked car, the arrival of daylight marks the beginning of an entirely different set of challenges. The cold hasn't lifted in any meaningful way. Daytime highs in the depth of an Anchorage winter often barely climb above the teens, and in Fairbanks, further inland, they can stay well below zero for days on end. But the character of survival shifts once the sun is up, moving from the acute, hour-by-hour vigilance of the night toward a longer, slower kind of endurance that has to stretch across the coming 12 or so hours until darkness falls again. The first order of business for almost everyone is finding somewhere warm to be during the day, and the options here are different from the nighttime landscape in important ways. Overnight shelters typically require residents to leave by early morning, clearing beds and floor space to prepare for the next night's arrivals, which means a person who slept in a shelter overnight is, paradoxically, often facing the exact same problem they solved the night before all over again by mid-morning. Day shelters exist specifically to fill this gap, though there are typically fewer of them than overnight facilities, and they operate on a different rhythm, offering a warm room to sit, sometimes a shower, sometimes laundry facilities, sometimes simply 4 walls and a chair, without the sleeping arrangements that define the nighttime version of the same basic service. Drying out gear becomes a genuine priority during these daylight hours, one that matters more than people who've never had to think about it might expect. A sleeping bag or set of clothes that absorbed even a small amount of moisture overnight, from breath condensing inside a hood, from snow tracked in and melted by body heat, from the simple sweat of moving between locations, needs to dry before the next night begins, because wet insulation is, as established, dramatically less effective than dry insulation at holding in body heat. Someday, shelters and laundromats that tolerate extended stays become informal drying stations, gear draped over chairs and radiators, a quiet, practical ritual repeated by dozens of people independently across the city every single day of the winter. Libraries occupy a particularly important place in this daytime landscape, and it's worth understanding why, beyond the simple fact that they're warm and free to enter. A public library offers something most other daytime spaces don't. A place where a person can sit for hours without being expected to buy anything, without needing to explain their situation to anyone, without a time limit pushing them back out into the cold. Librarians in cities with significant homeless populations have, over the years, developed their own informal expertise in this reality, some undergoing specific training in de-escalation and connecting patrons with services, understanding that for a meaningful number of the people using their reading rooms on any given winter day, the library isn't just a place to read. It's one of the only warm, dignified, judgment-free indoor spaces available to them at all. Books get read, certainly, but so does the newspaper, cover to cover, slowly, in a warm chair, simply because there's nowhere better to be and no reason to rush through it. Cafes and fast food restaurants play a smaller, more contested version of this same role. A cup of coffee, purchased for a few dollars, buys a seat and warmth for as long as staff are willing to tolerate it, which varies enormously by location and by individual manager, creating a patchwork of informally known, friendly, and unfriendly spots that gets passed along through the same word-of-mouth networks that map out nighttime shelter and parking options. Some businesses have quietly developed reputations within the unsheltered community as places that won't rush a person out even after their coffee's gone cold and the cup's long empty. Others make their unwelcome clear within minutes. Navigating this landscape, learning which doors stay open and which ones don't, is its own accumulated skill, refined the same way every other piece of this survival knowledge gets refined, through repetition, through mistakes, through information passed from person to person within a community that depends on shared knowledge to get by. Transit itself offers a strange kind of daytime shelter that exists in a legal and social gray area most riders never think about. A city bus, running its regular route through the worst of the winter, is warm, and a fare, where one is required, is cheap compared to almost any other form of extended indoor time a person could buy. Some people spend hours riding buses back and forth across a city's route system during the coldest days, not because they need to get anywhere in particular, but because the bus itself is the destination. A warm, moving room that asks little of its passengers beyond the fare and basic behavioral expectations. Transit authorities in cold climate cities are generally aware this happens and mostly tolerate it, understanding it as a low-cost, informal piece of the broader winter survival infrastructure that would otherwise fall entirely on shelters and warming centers already stretched thin. Physical exhaustion compounds everything else during these daytime hours in ways that are easy to underestimate from the outside. A person who slept in short, fragmented cycles through the coldest part of the night, who spent hours in genuine cold before finding shelter or warmth, is operating on a significant sleep deficit that doesn't simply resolve because the sun came up. Cognitive function suffers under this kind of chronic sleep deprivation. Decision-making gets harder, patience runs thinner. The accumulated fatigue of weeks or months of broken sleep through an entire winter season builds into something that researchers studying homelessness describe as a serious, underappreciated health burden in its own right, separate from but compounding every other challenge of surviving without stable housing in this climate. And yet, within all of this, the daytime hours also carry a different kind of activity that matters just as much to survival as the physical logistics of staying warm, the maintenance of relationships, of community, of the informal networks that make it through the winter together, rather than as isolated individuals each fending entirely for themselves. Daytime is when appointments happen, when a person might meet with a caseworker at a nonprofit trying to help them access permanent housing, when paperwork gets filled out for benefits or identification documents that were lost or never had, when a job interview, if one's been arranged, has to happen, despite the exhaustion and the cold, And the simple logistical challenge of arriving presentable when presentable is a genuinely difficult standard to meet without stable access to a shower, clean clothes, or a mirror. Outreach organizations structure much of their daytime work around exactly these needs, running case management services alongside the more immediately visible warming and feeding programs. A caseworker's job, done well, involves building the same kind of slow, patient trust that nighttime outreach workers build on the street, showing up consistently, remembering names and details, treating each person's situation as the specific individual problem it actually is, rather than a generic case to be processed. Progress, when it happens, tends to happen slowly, across months or years rather than single dramatic interventions, and setbacks are common and expected rather than treated as failures. A housing placement that falls through, an appointment missed because transportation didn't work out, a relapse that undoes months of careful progress. The work continues anyway, because the alternative, for the people depending on it, is facing another winter with nothing changed. As the short winter day wears on, sunset in Anchorage during December arrives shockingly early, sometimes before 4 in the afternoon, giving the whole day an almost twilight quality even at its brightest. The same calculation that opened the previous evening begins to repeat itself. Where will tonight be spent? What's open? What's full? Who's around? What the wind is doing? What the forecast says about how cold it's actually going to get once the sun is fully gone. This cyclical, relentless quality is, in many ways, the defining feature of surviving an entire Alaskan winter without stable housing. Not any single brutal night, but the accumulation of dozens of them in a row, each one requiring the same vigilance, the same careful management of clothing and shelter and community, stretched across months that don't offer much room for a single mistake to go unnoticed or unaddressed. Food occupies a place in this survival system that goes well beyond simple hunger. And understanding its role means understanding something most people never have reason to think carefully about: the direct physiological link between what a person eats and their ability to survive extreme cold. The human body, at rest, burns a baseline number of calories simply maintaining its core temperature, and that number climbs substantially in genuinely cold conditions, as the body works harder to generate the heat needed to offset what's being lost to the surrounding air. A person who's underfed is, in the most literal biological sense, running low on the fuel their body needs to keep itself warm, which means access to adequate food isn't a peripheral concern in this story. It's as central to surviving the night as the shelter and clothing already covered. Soup kitchens and meal programs form one of the oldest and most consistent pieces of Anchorage's winter survival infrastructure, some run by long-standing local nonprofits, others by churches that have offered hot meals to anyone who walks through the door for decades, long before homelessness in Alaska became the more visible, more discussed issue it is today. These programs typically operate on predictable daily schedules, and that predictability matters enormously to the people relying on them, since knowing exactly when and where a hot meal will be available lets someone plan the rest of their day around it, fitting warming center visits, appointments, and travel between locations into the gaps around mealtimes rather than wandering without any structure at all. The food itself tends to prioritize exactly the kind of calorie-dense, warming fare that cold weather survival actually calls for, even if the volunteers preparing it are thinking more in terms of comfort and tradition than nutritional science. Hearty stews, chili, casseroles, thick soups loaded with meat and starches, the kind of cooking that developed, historically, in cold climates precisely because it delivers sustained energy efficiently. Coffee, always coffee, served constantly, and often the first thing offered to anyone walking in from the cold, valued as much for its warmth in the hands and the excuse to sit for a few extra minutes, as for the mild stimulant effect. Bread, when available, gets taken and pocketed as often as eaten on the spot, saved for later in the day when the next meal might be hours away and hunger might strike at an inconvenient moment, far from any kitchen serving food. Beyond the organized meal programs, food access involves its own informal economy and set of skills, much like everything else in this survival landscape. Grocery stores sometimes donate food nearing its sell-by date to local shelters and pantries rather than discarding it, a practice that's become more common and more formalized in recent years as food waste and food insecurity have both received more public attention. Some restaurants quietly set aside unsold food at closing time for outreach workers or shelter staff to pick up. And individuals within the unsheltered community develop their own knowledge of exactly where and when these opportunities arise, information that circulates the same way every other piece of practical survival knowledge does, through relationships, through trust, through the accumulated experience of people who've spent enough winters here to know the rhythms of the city's charitable and commercial food systems better than most permanent residents ever will. Malnutrition remains a real and serious risk despite all of this infrastructure, and it's worth being honest about that rather than presenting Anchorage's meal programs as a complete solution to a problem that, in truth, they only partially address. Meal program hours don't always align neatly with a person's actual schedule and needs, particularly for anyone managing work, appointments, or the sheer logistics of surviving a winter day across the city. Dietary restrictions, food allergies, and the specific nutritional needs of people managing chronic health conditions aren't always accommodated by programs designed to serve as many people as efficiently as possible with whatever food happens to be donated on a given day. And the psychological toll of relying entirely on charity for something as basic as food, meal after meal, month after month, carries its own weight that outreach workers and researchers alike describe as a real, if less physically visible, cost of extended homelessness in a climate this demanding. Water, discussed briefly already in the context of overnight survival, deserves its own attention here in the daylight hours, because access to clean drinking water is a challenge that persists around the clock, but takes different forms depending on the time of day. Public drinking fountains, common in warmer climates as a reliable free water source, are largely useless in an Alaskan winter, frozen solid for months at a stretch. Bottled water, purchased or donated, becomes the more reliable daytime option, alongside the water fountains and taps available inside libraries, day shelters, and other indoor spaces a person might pass through over the course of a day. Staying adequately hydrated in cold weather is a genuinely counterintuitive challenge, since the body's thirst signal weakens in cold temperatures compared to hot ones, meaning people are less likely to notice they need water, even as their actual fluid needs, driven by the dry winter air and the physical exertion of navigating the cold, remain just as real. By late afternoon, as the light starts fading again toward another long winter night, the day's accumulated small victories and small setbacks settle into whatever they're going to be. A meal secured, an appointment kept or missed, a dry pair of socks found or not found. Layer by layer, meal by meal, warm room by warm room, the day has been managed, survived, gotten through. Not dramatically, not with any single decisive act of heroism, but through the same patient, practical competence that defines every other piece of this story. And as the temperature begins its familiar evenings slide back toward the coldest hours ahead, the whole cycle prepares to begin again, the way it will, night after night, day after day, for as long as this particular winter lasts. The medical realities of surviving repeated exposure to extreme cold deserve careful, unhurried attention. because they explain so much of why the routines already described, the layering, the wind blocking, the deliberate wake cycles through the night, exist in the specific, precise forms they do. Frostbite and hypothermia aren't abstract dangers in this story. They're the two conditions that every piece of survival knowledge passed between people on Anchorage's streets ultimately exists to prevent, and understanding how they actually develop in the body makes clear why so much careful attention gets paid to details that might otherwise seem excessive. Frostbite begins, physiologically, with the body's own defense mechanism working against the extremities in service of protecting the core. As skin temperature drops, blood vessels near the surface constrict, redirecting blood flow inward to protect vital organs, which means fingers, toes, ears, and the nose receive progressively less warm blood the longer a person stays in cold conditions. Eventually, ice crystals begin forming within the tissue itself, damaging cells directly, and if the process continues far enough, that damage becomes irreversible, leading in severe cases to the loss of the affected tissue entirely. The early stages, sometimes called frostnip, present as numbness and a pale, waxy appearance in the skin, and this stage is fully reversible with prompt rewarming. The danger lies in how easy it is to miss these early signs, particularly in fingers or toes that a person can't easily see or feel clearly, and particularly for someone already exhausted, already managing multiple other survival priorities at once, for whom checking their own extremities every 20 minutes isn't always the first thing on their mind. This is precisely why the buddy system that develops informally within unsheltered communities matters as much as it does. A second person, watching for the telltale white or grayish patches on someone's exposed cheeks or nose, catching a warning sign that the affected person might not notice in themselves until it's more advanced. Outreach workers making their nightly rounds are trained specifically to look for these signs, checking exposed skin on the people they encounter, offering treatment referrals or direct transport to emergency care when something looks serious enough to warrant it. Anchorage's emergency rooms see a predictable seasonal pattern of frostbite cases every winter, clustering during the coldest cold snaps, and hospital staff who work these shifts describe a grim but practical familiarity with treating it, understanding exactly which patients are most likely to need immediate rewarming and close monitoring for the tissue damage that sometimes doesn't become fully apparent until days after the initial exposure. Hypothermia presents a different, in some ways more insidious danger because its early symptoms can mimic simple exhaustion, making it harder for a person to recognize what's actually happening to their own body. As core temperature drops even a few degrees below normal, shivering begins as the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle activity, accompanied by clumsiness, slurred speech, and a creeping mental confusion that experienced outreach workers learn to recognize even in brief encounters. As the condition worsens, paradoxically, the shivering can stop altogether, which some people mistakenly interpret as improvement when it actually signals a more dangerous, deeper stage, one where the body has essentially given up trying to warm itself and is beginning to shut down non-essential functions to conserve whatever core heat remains. The behavioral changes associated with hypothermia are particularly dangerous because they can lead a person to make decisions that actively worsen their situation. A phenomenon sometimes called paradoxical undressing, where a person in advanced hypothermia begins removing clothing despite the extreme cold, occurs because the blood vessels near the skin, exhausted from prolonged constriction, suddenly dilate, creating a brief, false sensation of warmth, even as the body's actual core temperature continues falling. Outreach workers who've encountered this in the field describe it as one of the most alarming things to witness, precisely because it looks, superficially, like someone simply not thinking clearly about their own safety, when in fact it's a specific, recognizable medical emergency requiring immediate intervention. This is where the informal medical knowledge circulating within Anchorage's unsheltered community becomes genuinely impressive, built up over years of shared experience, and in some cases, formal training offered by local nonprofits specifically to help people recognize these dangers in themselves and each other. Longtime residents of this world can often identify the early stages of hypothermia in someone else faster than a person less familiar with the specific signs might, simply because they've seen it before, sometimes many times, and know exactly what to watch for, and exactly how urgent the response needs to be. Substance use complicates this medical picture in ways that outreach workers and researchers discuss with real nuance, avoiding the temptation to reduce a complicated reality to a simple morality tale. Alcohol, in particular, creates a genuinely dangerous interaction with cold exposure, because it causes the same peripheral blood vessel dilation responsible for paradoxical undressing, creating a false sensation of warmth that can lead a person to underestimate how cold they actually are, while simultaneously impairing the judgment and physical coordination needed to seek shelter or recognize danger signs in time. This is part of why some shelters maintain strict sobriety requirements for entry, a policy that protects the shelter environment, but also, unavoidably, excludes some of the people at highest immediate risk on any given cold night, which is exactly the gap that wet shelters, facilities specifically designed to accommodate people who are intoxicated, prioritizing survival over sobriety requirements, exist to fill, though they remain relatively rare and chronically underfunded compared to the scale of need. Mental illness intersects with all of this in ways that are equally important to understand honestly. A significant portion of Anchorage's chronically unsheltered population manages some form of mental illness, sometimes diagnosed and treated, often not, and the specific challenges this creates for winter survival are considerable. Untreated psychiatric conditions can impair a person's ability to plan ahead, to consistently follow the kind of careful, deliberate routines that surviving extreme cold requires, or to trust and engage with the outreach workers and shelter staff trying to help them. Outreach teams working in this space develop specific skills for building rapport with people experiencing acute mental health symptoms, understanding that a calm, patient, non-confrontational approach, repeated consistently over time, tends to succeed where a single urgent intervention often fails. Chronic health conditions unrelated to cold exposure directly also compound the danger in ways worth acknowledging. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and respiratory conditions all interact badly with extreme cold, and managing any of these conditions without stable housing, without reliable refrigeration for medication, without consistent access to medical care, adds another layer of genuine difficulty to a situation that's already demanding under the best of circumstances. Mobile health clinics, some run by local hospital systems and others by dedicated homeless health nonprofits, exist specifically to close some of this gap, bringing basic medical care, medication management, and wound care directly to the places where unsheltered people are known to gather, reducing at least some of the barriers that would otherwise keep chronic conditions from ever being properly managed at all. Emergency medical response for anyone showing serious signs of hypothermia or advanced frostbite is understandably treated as an urgent priority by both outreach workers and, when called, Anchorage's paramedics and hospital staff. Rewarming a severely hypothermic person requires real medical care and careful monitoring, since rewarming too quickly or in the wrong way can itself trigger dangerous complications, including a phenomenon where cold, oxygen-depleted blood that's been pooled in the extremities suddenly returns to the heart as circulation resumes, occasionally triggering cardiac arrhythmias in already stressed patients. This is why the guidance experienced outreach workers give, and the training they receive, emphasizes getting a severely affected person to professional medical care as quickly as possible, rather than attempting extensive field treatment beyond basic, careful warming and shelter from further exposure. Behind all of this medical reality sits a broader public health infrastructure that most residents of Anchorage rarely think about, but that becomes, every winter, a genuinely load-bearing part of the city's response to extreme cold. Hospital emergency departments coordinate informally with shelter and outreach organizations, sometimes discharging patients directly into a warm shelter bed rather than back onto the street when a hospital stay ends during a cold snap. Public health officials track cold-related injuries and deaths as a specific category of concern, using that data to advocate for expanded shelter capacity and outreach funding in years when the numbers climb. None of this infrastructure eliminates the danger entirely. Alaska, like every cold climate region with a significant unsheltered population, loses people to exposure every winter, a fact that outreach workers and public health officials alike speak about with a mixture of grief and grim determination to keep the number as low as humanly possible. But the infrastructure that does exist, quietly, unglamorously, in emergency rooms and mobile clinics and outreach vans circling the same streets night after night, represents a genuine, sustained effort to meet an extraordinarily difficult problem with everything a resource-constrained system can bring to bear. Not every person navigating an Alaskan winter without stable housing faces the exact same set of challenges, and understanding the different populations within this broader story matters, because a single generic picture of homelessness misses just how differently this experience plays out, depending on who a person is and how they came to be here. Families with children represent one of the most acutely difficult situations within this landscape, and the numbers, while smaller than the adult single population, carry a particular weight that shelter staff and caseworkers describe as some of the hardest work they do. A parent trying to keep a child warm, fed, and safe through an Alaskan winter without a permanent home faces every challenge already described here, multiplied by the responsibility of protecting someone else who's far more physically vulnerable to cold than an adult, and who doesn't yet have the coping skills or physical resilience that years of hard experience build in adults. Shelters equipped to house families together are considerably rarer than general adult shelter beds, a scarcity that creates its own specific crisis during severe cold snaps, when a family unable to find space in one of these limited family-specific facilities faces the genuinely wrenching possibility of being separated, with children sometimes placed with relatives in foster care or in a youth-specific shelter, while parents seek space elsewhere. Nonprofit organizations focused specifically on family homelessness in Alaska work hard to prevent exactly this outcome, prioritizing family shelter placement and emergency housing assistance as urgently as any other service they provide, precisely because keeping families intact through a housing crisis is understood, both practically and by any reasonable ethical standard, as a priority that outweighs almost every other consideration in the response system. Older adults experiencing homelessness face a different but equally serious set of risks, since aging bodies are measurably less efficient at generating and retaining heat, and chronic health conditions that become more common with age compound the danger of extended cold exposure in ways that make even a single difficult night considerably more hazardous than the same night would be for a younger, healthier person. Outreach workers pay particular attention to elderly individuals during their nightly rounds, understanding that the margin for error is simply smaller, and that a night and healthier adult might get through uncomfortably, but safely could genuinely threaten an older person's life under the same conditions. Veterans make up a disproportionately large share of Alaska's homeless population relative to their share of the general population, a pattern that mirrors homelessness statistics across the country and that reflects the complicated intersection of military service, service-connected injuries, both physical and psychological, and the sometimes difficult transition back to civilian life. Alaska's substantial veteran population, drawn partly by the state's significant military presence, means this particular pathway into homelessness shows up here with real frequency, and veteran-specific outreach programs, often connected to VA services, work specifically to identify and assist veterans navigating homelessness, understanding that service-connected trauma and disability sometimes require a different kind of support than general homeless services are equipped to provide. Young people experiencing homelessness, including a meaningful number of LGBTQ+ youth who've been rejected by family, represent another distinct population within this story, one that youth-focused shelters and outreach programs work specifically to serve, recognizing that the needs, risks, and appropriate interventions for someone in their late teens or early 20s differ substantially from the needs of an older, longer-term, unsheltered adult. And Alaska Native individuals, who are represented among the state's unsheltered population at rates that reflect broader, painful historical and systemic patterns affecting indigenous communities across the country, sometimes navigate this experience with an additional layer of complexity tied to distance from rural home communities, cultural dislocation, and the specific historical trauma that continues to shape health and housing outcomes for Indigenous Alaskans today. Culturally specific outreach and shelter programs, some run by Alaska Native corporations and nonprofits, work to address this population's needs with an understanding and cultural competency that generic services sometimes lack. Across every one of these distinct populations, though, runs the same underlying thread that's shaped every part of this story so far. The same brutal, indifferent cold, the same nightly calculation of where to be and how to stay warm, and the same quiet, persistent human capacity to adapt, to build knowledge, to look out for each other, that carries people through one more night, and then the next one, and then the one after that, for as long as an Alaskan winter demands it of them. To understand why so many people find themselves without stable housing in a place as demanding as Alaska in the first place, it helps to set aside any assumption that the answer is simple, because it rarely is. The pathways into homelessness here are varied, often layered with more than one contributing factor, and understanding them with some care matters, not as an academic exercise, but because it explains a great deal about why the survival system already described, the shelters, the outreach networks, the informal community knowledge, exists in the specific shape it does, built by and for people carrying very different histories into the same brutal winter nights. Alaska's housing market plays a substantial role that surprises people unfamiliar with the state's economics. Anchorage, despite its relatively modest size compared to major cities in the lower 48, carries housing costs that reflect the genuine expense of building and maintaining structures in a subarctic climate, combined with the logistical costs of shipping materials to a state largely disconnected from the continental highway and rail network. Rental costs have climbed steadily for years, outpacing wage growth for many of the service and seasonal jobs that make up a significant portion of the local economy, creating exactly the kind of gap between income and housing costs that researchers consistently identify as one of the strongest predictors of homelessness in any region, regardless of climate. Seasonal and migratory work patterns add a distinctly Alaskan wrinkle to this picture. The state's economy depends heavily on seasonal industries. Commercial fishing, tourism, construction work, compressed into the brief window when the ground isn't frozen solid. And this creates a recurring cycle where workers arrive from elsewhere chasing summer employment, sometimes with promises of housing included that fall through, sometimes without having fully planned for what happens once the season ends and the work dries up. Some of these workers find themselves stranded in Anchorage or Fairbanks as autumn turns to winter, without enough saved from a summer's wages to secure permanent housing, without family or established community in the state to fall back on, and without the resources to simply leave before winter arrives in full force. Outreach workers describe seeing this pattern repeat with real regularity, a specific, identifiable subset of the unsheltered population whose path into this situation began with a job that seemed like a reasonable bet at the time. Substance use disorder and mental illness, already discussed in terms of how they complicate survival once someone is unsheltered, also frequently appear as contributing factors to how people become unsheltered in the first place, though the relationship runs in both directions in ways that resist any simple cause and effect story. Sometimes, addiction or untreated mental illness precedes and directly contributes to the loss of housing, employment, and family support that leads to homelessness. Just as often, the trauma and instability of homelessness itself worsens or triggers mental health struggles and substance use that weren't the original cause at all, creating a difficult cycle that makes the path back to stable housing considerably harder to navigate the longer it continues. Domestic violence and family breakdown represent another significant, if less publicly discussed, pathway, particularly for women, and for the families sometimes fleeing dangerous home situations with nowhere else immediately available to go. Alaska's rate of reported domestic violence is notably high relative to national averages, a statistic that public health researchers and advocacy organizations in the state have worked for years to address. And the connection between fleeing violence and experiencing homelessness, at least temporarily, is well documented and well understood by the shelter and outreach organizations working in this space, some of which maintain specific, often confidential, capacity to serve exactly this population separately from general shelter services. The lack of affordable, culturally appropriate housing options for Alaska Native individuals moving from rural villages to Anchorage or Fairbanks constitutes its own specific and well-documented pathway, one tied to broader historical patterns of displacement, economic disruption, and the genuine difficulty of navigating an urban housing and job market after growing up in a small, remote community with an entirely different economic and social structure. This pathway carries layers of historical context, federal policies, the long aftermath of forced relocation and assimilation efforts, the economic transformation of rural Alaska over the past century, that go well beyond what any single documentary segment could adequately cover. But acknowledging it matters, because it shapes a meaningful portion of who ends up navigating Anchorage's winters without stable housing, and why. Veterans, as already discussed, arrive at homelessness through their own specific set of pathways, often connected to service-related physical injury, post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, or the more general difficulty some service members experience reintegrating into civilian, economic, and social life after years spent in a highly structured military environment. The VA and veteran-specific nonprofits have worked for years to reduce veteran homelessness specifically, with real measurable success at the national level, though Alaska's particular combination of high housing costs, extreme climate, and substantial veteran population continues to make it one of the harder places in the country to fully close this gap. Aging out of foster care represents a pathway that disproportionately affects younger people within Alaska's unsheltered population, since young adults who exit the foster system at 18 or 21, often without the family safety net that most people rely on during the vulnerable early years of full independence, face a genuinely difficult transition that a meaningful number don't navigate successfully without ending up, at least temporarily, without stable housing. Youth-specific shelters and transitional housing programs exist specifically to address this gap, recognizing that the needs of a 19-year-old navigating this situation are different in important ways from the needs of an older, longer-term unsheltered adult. Medical debt and sudden health crises round out the picture as a pathway that can affect almost anyone, regardless of how stable their life looked before the crisis hit. A serious illness or injury, combined with lost income during recovery and the accumulated cost of medical care, can exhaust savings and lead to eviction or foreclosure with a speed that surprises people who assume homelessness only happens to those already living on the margins. This pathway is a reminder, one that caseworkers and outreach staff mention often, that the line between stable housing and homelessness is, for a meaningful number of people, thinner and more circumstantial than most of us are comfortable acknowledging. What emerges from all of these varied pathways is not a single simple story, but a genuinely complicated intersection of economic pressure, personal history, systemic gaps, and sometimes simple bad luck arriving at the worst possible moment. This complexity matters for understanding the survival system already described throughout this story, because it explains why Anchorage's response to winter homelessness isn't, and can't be, a single solution. It has to be a whole ecosystem of overlapping services: shelters and warming centers, meal programs and medical outreach, family-specific and youth-specific and veteran-specific support, culturally competent services for Alaska Native residents, domestic violence resources, addiction, and mental health treatment, because the population it's serving arrived at this point in their lives through genuinely different roads, each requiring a somewhat different kind of help to eventually lead back out again. And within all of this complexity, the nightly reality remains constant regardless of how any individual person arrived at it. When the temperature drops and the wind picks up and the long Alaskan darkness settles back over the city, the calculation is the same for everyone facing it. Where to go, what to wear, who to check on, how to make it, once again, safely through until morning. The reasons behind how someone came to be facing that calculation vary enormously. The calculation itself, and the quiet, hard-won expertise required to answer it correctly night after night, does not. Everything described so far has centered largely on Anchorage, and for good reason. It's Alaska's largest city, home to the greatest concentration of both unsheltered individuals and the shelter and outreach infrastructure built to serve them. But Alaska's geography is vast and varied in ways that shape this story very differently, depending on where exactly a person finds themselves facing a winter night without stable housing. And understanding those differences matters for getting an honest, complete picture of what survival looks like across the state, rather than in just its largest urban center. Fairbanks, several hundred miles north of Anchorage and considerably more continental in its climate, presents an even harsher baseline than the coastal moderation Anchorage benefits from. Where Anchorage's proximity to the ocean keeps its winter temperatures from swinging as wildly as they might otherwise, Fairbanks experiences some of the most extreme cold of any American city, with temperatures regularly dropping to 40 or 50 below zero during the deepest stretches of winter. Cold severe enough that exposed skin can suffer frostbite in a matter of minutes, rather than the half hour or so more typical of Anchorage's comparatively milder nights. Fairbanks also experiences a phenomenon called ice fog during its coldest snaps, a dense, suspended cloud of ice crystals that forms when moisture in the air freezes directly, reducing visibility and adding another layer of difficulty to an already dangerous environment for anyone trying to navigate the city on foot after dark. The shelter and outreach infrastructure in Fairbanks, while genuine and dedicated, operates on a considerably smaller scale than Anchorage's, a reflection of the city's smaller overall population and correspondingly smaller unsheltered community. Though the ratio of need to available resources doesn't necessarily favor Fairbanks simply because the absolute numbers are lower. Local shelters and warming centers there work under the same fundamental capacity pressures during severe cold snaps, sometimes activating emergency overflow space in similar fashion to Anchorage's system, drawing on a smaller pool of nonprofit organizations and volunteers stretched across a genuinely brutal climate that offers even less margin for error than the state's largest city does. Beyond these two urban centers, Alaska's rural communities and smaller towns present an entirely different version of this challenge, one shaped by isolation rather than scale. In a small village accessible only by plane or, in some seasons, by snow machine and boat, the shelter infrastructure that exists in Anchorage and Fairbanks simply isn't present in the same form. And homelessness in these communities, where it exists, often looks less like a person sleeping in a doorway and more like severe overcrowding. Multiple families sharing housing meant for far fewer people. A situation researchers and Alaska Native organizations describe as hidden homelessness, real housing instability that doesn't show up in the same visible way urban homelessness does, but that carries its own serious risks, particularly during the coldest months when overcrowded, sometimes poorly maintained housing struggles to keep everyone inside adequately warm. Migration between these different parts of the state adds another layer to the picture. Some people experiencing homelessness in rural communities eventually make their way to Anchorage specifically because the city offers a shelter and service infrastructure their home community simply can't match, a decision that solves one problem, access to services, while often creating new ones, including the cultural and social dislocation of leaving behind a home community, however difficult conditions there might have been, for the anonymity and unfamiliarity of a much larger city. Outreach organizations that work specifically with Alaska Native clients navigating this transition describe it as one of the more emotionally complicated aspects of their work, helping people access resources that genuinely improve their immediate physical safety while remaining aware of everything that gets left behind in the process. Weather itself varies enough across the state to meaningfully change the nature of the survival challenge from region to region. Coastal communities in southeast Alaska, around Juneau and Sitka, experience a maritime climate that, while still genuinely cold and wet through the winter, rarely reaches the extreme low temperatures common in Fairbanks or the state's interior, trading brutal cold for near-constant winter rain and damp that create their own distinct set of challenges. Since staying dry, rather than simply staying warm, becomes the dominant concern in a climate where clothing and gear can stay perpetually damp for days at a stretch. Anyone navigating homelessness in this region faces a genuinely different set of practical problems than someone in Fairbanks, even though both are, in the broadest sense, surviving an Alaskan winter without stable shelter. Across all of these variations in geography and climate, though, certain elements of this story remain remarkably consistent, and it's worth pausing to notice them because they say something true about how communities respond to genuine crisis, regardless of their specific circumstances. Every region of the state, from its largest city to its smallest village, has developed some version of the same basic response. Informal networks of mutual aid among people facing the same hardship, nonprofit and faith-based organizations stepping in to fill gaps that government resources alone can't cover, and a body of accumulated, practical survival knowledge passed from person to person, because it has to be, because the alternative to that knowledge existing and circulating is a body count that no community, however under-resourced, is willing to simply accept. Behind every warming center, every meal program, every outreach van, making its slow rounds through Anchorage's coldest streets, there are people whose entire job, in one sense or another, is standing between their neighbors and the specific dangers this climate presents. And understanding their work in more depth rounds out this story in an important way. Outreach work of this kind isn't glamorous, and the people doing it will mostly tell you so themselves if asked. It's long shifts in brutal cold, repetitive conversations, and a job that measures success not in dramatic rescues, but in the quiet, cumulative effect of showing up, night after night, reliably enough that trust eventually builds where it didn't exist before. Training for this work covers a genuinely wide range of skills, blending practical medical knowledge, recognizing the early signs of frostbite and hypothermia, basic first aid, when a situation requires an ambulance rather than simply a blanket and a ride to shelter, with the softer, harder-to-teach skills of de-escalation, trust building, and what social workers sometimes call harm reduction, an approach that prioritizes keeping someone alive and as safe as possible right now, even if they're not ready to accept every form of help being offered, rather than withholding assistance until a person meets some ideal standard of readiness that might never arrive. Volunteers make up a substantial portion of the workforce behind Anchorage's winter response system, working alongside paid staff at shelters, meal programs, and outreach organizations, and their motivations, when outreach coordinators describe them, tend to be remarkably ordinary and human, a desire to help, sometimes rooted in personal experience with homelessness or addiction within their own family, sometimes simply a wish to do something concrete and useful during the darkest, coldest months of the year, rather than watching the crisis unfold from a distance. Training programs for new volunteers typically emphasize the same core lessons paid staff learn, adapted for people who might only be working a handful of shifts across the winter, rather than making this their full-time work. How to recognize genuine medical emergencies, how to communicate respectfully and without judgment, and, importantly, how to manage the emotional weight of encountering, repeatedly, a level of hardship that most volunteers haven't personally experienced. That emotional weight deserves honest acknowledgement, because burnout among outreach workers and shelter staff is a well-documented, serious challenge for organizations trying to sustain this work across years and decades, rather than just a single dramatic winter. Watching people struggle, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes without the kind of clear forward progress that would make the difficulty feel worthwhile, takes a genuine toll. And organizations that manage to retain experienced staff over long periods tend to be the ones that take this seriously, building in support systems, reasonable schedules, and a culture that treats small, incremental progress as the genuine success it actually is, rather than measuring the work against an unrealistic standard of dramatic, complete transformation that rarely happens on any predictable timeline. There's a particular kind of expertise that develops in people who've done this work for years, one that outreach coordinators describe with real respect when talking about their most experienced staff. It shows in small things, knowing, from years of pattern recognition, which regular faces are likely to accept a ride to shelter tonight, and which ones need a different, gentler approach. Recognizing the specific tone of voice or body language that signals someone is in real medical danger versus simply exhausted. Understanding, almost intuitively at this point, exactly how a given cold snap is likely to affect the population they serve, and adjusting outreach patterns accordingly before the worst of it even arrives. This expertise rarely gets formally recognized or well compensated relative to its actual value, but it represents one of the most important, if least visible, resources keeping Alaska's winter response system functioning as well as it does, year after year, cold snap after cold snap. Every Alaskan winter includes at least a handful of nights that stand apart from the rest, stretches of days when the temperature drops well beyond even the normal severe range, when wind chills push toward numbers that sound almost fictional to anyone who hasn't lived through them, and when the entire, carefully calibrated system described throughout this story gets tested in ways that reveal both its strengths and its very real limits. Understanding how a genuine cold emergency event unfolds, from forecast to aftermath, offers a clearer picture of just how much coordinated effort goes into protecting a city's most vulnerable residents during the moments when the stakes climb highest. These events, typically, begin days in advance, as meteorologists tracking the specific atmospheric patterns that produce Alaska's most extreme cold, often a combination of a strong high-pressure system settling over the interior and clear, still nights that allow heat to radiate away from the ground with nothing to trap it, start flagging the coming severity to city officials and the nonprofit organizations that coordinate winter response. This advance warning matters enormously because it gives the response system time to prepare rather than react, time to secure additional shelter space, arrange extra staffing, and push public warnings out through every available channel before the worst of the cold actually arrives. City governments in Alaska's major population centers typically maintain some formal mechanism for declaring a cold weather emergency, a designation that unlocks additional resources and authority that don't exist under normal operating conditions. This might mean opening auxiliary shelter space in buildings not normally used for this purpose, a community recreation center, an underused portion of a public building, staffed on short notice by a combination of existing shelter personnel and volunteers mobilized specifically for the emergency. It often means extending the operating hours of existing warming centers, sometimes to run continuously around the clock, rather than closing during daytime hours, as they might on a merely cold rather than extreme day. Outreach efforts intensify dramatically during these declared emergencies. Vans that might normally run 1 or 2 circuits through the city on a typical winter evening increase their frequency substantially, and staffing gets pulled from other duties specifically to maximize the number of people making direct contact with anyone still outside as conditions worsen. The message during these intensified rounds shifts too, becoming more urgent and more insistent than the gentler, patient approach used on an ordinary cold night, because the margin for error during a genuine extreme event is simply thinner, and outreach workers describe a real tension in these moments between respecting a person's autonomy to decline help and recognizing that a given night's conditions have crossed into territory where declining shelter carries a genuinely severe risk to survival. Public communication plays a significant role during these events as well, with local media, city government channels, and social media accounts run by shelter and outreach organizations all working to spread the same core message as widely as possible: where warming centers and emergency shelters are located, what hours they're operating under during the emergency, and how community members who notice someone in apparent distress outside can report it to get help dispatched. This public awareness component matters because it extends the reach of the formal outreach system, turning ordinary residents going about their day into an informal extension of the response network. Someone noticing a person who looks to be in genuine danger and knowing exactly which number to call rather than simply walking past uncertain what, if anything, they should do. Even with all of this coordinated effort, extreme cold events remain the moments when the system's genuine limitations become most visible, and honest accounts from people who work in this field don't shy away from acknowledging that. Shelter capacity, even expanded with emergency overflow space, has a hard ceiling, and a severe enough event can push demand right up against or past that ceiling, forcing genuinely difficult decisions about how to allocate limited beds among a population where, on the worst nights, essentially, everyone present has a legitimate claim to urgent need. Some people, for reasons already discussed, distrust of institutional settings, substance use that violates shelter rules, simply not being reached by outreach workers before conditions turned dangerous, remain outside even during a declared emergency. And these are the nights that account for most of the state's cold-related deaths and severe injuries each winter, concentrated disproportionately into the handful of truly extreme events rather than spread evenly across the whole season. The aftermath of a severe cold event typically includes some combination of relief and grim accounting, as outreach organizations and hospital staff assess how many people needed emergency medical treatment for frostbite or hypothermia, and, in the worst years, how many people didn't survive the event at all. This accounting isn't simply grim record-keeping. It directly informs how the response system adjusts going forward, identifying gaps that showed up under acute stress and feeding into decisions about where additional shelter capacity, additional outreach funding, or additional public education might reduce the toll of the next severe event whenever it arrives. Beyond any single night or single severe cold event, though, the larger goal that every outreach worker, shelter staff member, and caseworker mentioned throughout this story is ultimately working toward is something more permanent than simply surviving one more winter, helping people move out of homelessness entirely and into stable, lasting housing. This is, by a wide margin, the harder and slower half of the work, and understanding how it actually happens, when it happens, adds an important dimension to a story that could otherwise focus entirely on the crisis management side of survival without acknowledging the longer arc many people are working toward. The dominant model guiding this work in Anchorage and increasingly across the country is often described as housing first, an approach built on a specific, evidence-based premise that runs somewhat counter to older models of homeless services, that stable housing should be provided as quickly as possible without first requiring sobriety, mental health treatment compliance, or other conditions that used to be treated as prerequisites. The reasoning behind this shift, backed by a substantial body of research, is that it's extraordinarily difficult for someone to successfully address addiction, mental illness, or any other underlying challenge while still navigating the daily, exhausting crisis of unstable or absent housing. And that stability itself, once achieved, tends to make every other form of support and treatment considerably more effective than it would be otherwise. Implementing this approach in practice involves a substantial amount of patient, unglamorous casework. Helping someone navigate the application process for subsidized housing, working through the documentation requirements that can present a genuine barrier for someone who's lost identification, birth certificates, or other paperwork during years of housing instability, and building the ongoing relationship of support that helps a person maintain housing once they've secured it, since the transition into stable housing after an extended period of homelessness carries its own real adjustment challenges that aren't always anticipated by people encountering this population for the first time. Waitlists for subsidized and supportive housing in Anchorage, as in most American cities, stretch considerably longer than the available supply, meaning that even a person fully engaged with the system and doing everything asked of them often faces months or years of waiting before a housing placement actually becomes available. A gap that outreach and shelter services exist specifically to help bridge, keeping people as safe and stable as possible through what can be a genuinely long and difficult interim period. Transitional housing programs, offering a middle step between shelter and fully independent permanent housing, help fill part of this gap, providing a more stable, longer-term living situation with continued support services while a person works toward the more permanent placement, waiting somewhere further down the line. Success in this longer-term work looks different than the dramatic, single-moment success stories that might make for better television. And caseworkers who do this work describe it in correspondingly modest terms. A person maintaining housing for 6 months, then a year, then several years. A relapse that doesn't result in losing that housing entirely, because the support system built around the placement was flexible enough to accommodate a setback rather than treating it as an immediate failure requiring eviction. A relationship with family, estranged for years during the hardest period of homelessness, slowly repaired once some measure of stability returns. None of this happens quickly, and none of it happens for everyone, but it happens often enough, across enough individual cases over enough years, that the people doing this work describe genuine, sustained hope in it, even while acknowledging just how difficult and slow the path actually is. Eventually, whatever combination of survival and slower systemic progress a given winter has held, the season itself begins, gradually, to loosen its grip. The transition out of an Alaskan winter carries its own distinct rhythm and its own specific hazards, different from the deep cold challenges of December and January, but genuinely serious in their own right, and worth understanding as the final piece of this particular chapter in the yearly cycle this whole story has been tracing. As temperatures begin climbing above freezing during the day, even while still dropping below it at night, a treacherous freeze-thaw cycle takes hold across the city, turning packed snow and ice into slick, unpredictable surfaces that shift unpredictably between solid ice in the morning and slush by afternoon. This transitional period, often stretching from March into April or even May, depending on the specific year, creates its own injury risk profile, with falls on ice becoming a leading cause of the emergency room visits that outreach workers and shelter staff watch for just as carefully as they watch for frostbite during the deepest cold months. For someone without stable housing, navigating this unpredictable footing while carrying belongings, moving between shelter and daytime locations, adds a genuine physical hazard layered on top of everything else already described. Meltwater itself creates a different kind of challenge, pooling in low areas, soaking through footwear that was perfectly adequate for dry, packed snow, but never designed for standing water, and creating exactly the kind of dampness that, as already established, undermines the insulating properties clothing depends on to keep a person warm. Ironically, some of the more dangerous cold exposure incidents of the entire year happen not during the deepest cold of January, when everyone is maximally prepared and vigilant, but during these transitional weeks, when a milder daytime temperature creates a false sense of security that doesn't account for how quickly conditions can still turn dangerous once the sun goes down, and that same wet gear turns cold again. Still, for everyone who's made it through another Alaskan winter without stable housing, this thaw represents something genuinely significant, even if it comes with its own hazards. The relentless, nightly calculation that's defined every single day covered throughout this story. Where to sleep, how to stay warm, who to check on, begins to ease, not disappear entirely, since Alaska's spring and even summer nights can still turn cold enough to matter, but ease enough that the acute, life-threatening danger of the deepest winter months finally starts to recede. It's a genuine milestone, one that outreach workers describe with real, if measured, relief every single year, and it marks the end of this particular telling of a story that will inevitably begin building toward its next iteration again as the days shorten and the temperature starts its slow, familiar slide back down toward another Alaskan winter. Some months from now, somewhere in Anchorage tonight, the woman we've been calling Dolores throughout this story, a composite drawn from the accumulated experience of outreach workers who've spent years getting to know people like her rather than any single individual, is doing what she's done for 9 winters now, checking the wind, checking who's around, deciding, based on everything she's learned across those 9 hard seasons, exactly where tonight will be spent and exactly what it will take to see morning again. It's worth sitting with her story for a moment longer here, near the end of this account, because the details of an individual life do something the broader statistics and systems described throughout this story can't quite manage on their own. They make the abstract concrete, and they remind us that every number in every report represents a specific person navigating a specific, difficult set of circumstances with whatever resources and resilience they can bring to bear. Dolores arrived in Anchorage from a smaller community in the state's interior, drawn, like so many others, by the promise of work that partially materialized and then partially didn't, leaving her without enough saved to secure permanent housing before her first Anchorage winter closed in around her. That first winter, by her own account, shared with outreach workers over the years since, was the hardest, not because the cold itself was worse than any subsequent year, but because she hadn't yet built the knowledge, the routines, the relationships within the unsheltered community that would eventually make each following winter somewhat more survivable than the one before it. She learned the way everyone in this story has learned, through direct experience and through the generosity of people slightly further along the same road who took the time to share what they knew. 9 winters later, Dolores is, by the careful, unglamorous standards this work operates under, someone with genuine expertise. She knows which doorways hold heat and which only look like they should. She can read an approaching cold snap in the specific quality of a sunset days before the forecast confirms it. She's on a wait list for supportive housing, has been for over a year now, and she talks about that wait list with the same measured, patient realism she brings to everything else. Not despair, not false optimism, just a clear-eyed understanding that this, too, is simply the next thing to be managed. The way everything else has been managed, one day and one night at a time, for as long as it takes. Her story isn't unique, and it isn't meant to stand in for every experience covered throughout this account. The family separated by a lack of shelter space, the veteran navigating both physical and psychological injury, the young person who aged out of foster care with nowhere else to turn, the person fleeing violence with only what they could carry. Each of those stories carries its own specific texture, its own specific hardships, and flattening them into a single narrative would do a disservice to the genuine variety of human experience contained within Anchorage's broader, unsheltered population. But Dolores's story does share something with every other story this account has touched on, an underlying thread of competence, of accumulated knowledge, of quiet endurance that rarely gets acknowledged by anyone outside the world she spent 9 years learning to survive within. The outreach workers, who know her by name, describe her, when asked, in terms that emphasize exactly this competence rather than any narrative of simple victimhood. She's someone who looks out for newer arrivals to the street community, passing along the same knowledge that was passed to her 9 years ago. She's someone who notices before staff sometimes do, when someone else in her orbit is showing the early signs of frostbite or hypothermia, and who knows exactly how to get help quickly rather than waiting and hoping the situation improves on its own. This is, in its way, exactly what this entire story has been trying to illustrate from its opening minutes, that survival in conditions this extreme isn't a passive thing that simply happens to people. It's an active, ongoing, remarkably sophisticated practice, refined through hard experience and sustained through community, carried out by people who deserve to be understood as the capable, resourceful survivors they actually are, rather than reduced to a single word or a single, simplified story. That, more than anything else this account could offer, feels like the right note to end on. Not tragedy, though the danger throughout this story has been real and shouldn't be softened or minimized. Not simple triumph either, since the underlying crisis this story describes continues, unresolved, every single winter for thousands of people across this one state alone. Just this, an honest, careful look at what it actually takes to survive an Alaskan winter without 4 walls and a locked door, and a quiet, genuine respect for everyone who manages it, night after night, through means that deserve to be understood, remembered, and, wherever possible, supported by the rest of us, fortunate enough to be listening to this from somewhere warm. If you've made it this far, wherever you're listening from, whatever kind of night you're having, thank you for spending this time here. Let the last of these words settle over you the way warmth settles over a room after a long time out in the cold. There's nothing more you need to do right now except rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been holding tension. The city outside your own window, wherever that window happens to be tonight, is quiet. And so for now, is this story. If tonight's journey through Alaska's long winter darkness helped you find your way towards sleep, consider leaving it running, sharing it with someone else who might need the same, and subscribing for the next quiet, careful story waiting whenever you're ready for it. Until then, from Coldman's Survival, sleep well, stay warm, and we'll see you again next time. Good night.